Chapter 1. A cold, damp fog, typical of an early Dublin autumn, clung to the cobbled streets as the train pulled into Westland Row Station. Dr. John Watson, weary from the journey, adjusted his tweed cap and cast a hopeful glance at the bustling platform. "A breath of fresh air, Holmes," he remarked, turning to his companion. "A chance to enjoy the city before your grand discourse on forensic toxicology." Sherlock Holmes, however, was already scanning the faces in the crowd, his keen eyes missing nothing. He offered a noncommittal grunt, a clear indication that his mind was already engaged, though perhaps not yet with the intricacies of Dublin's historical architecture or its literary giants. They had indeed come to the Irish capital for Holmes to deliver a prestigious lecture at Trinity College, a rare venture into academic celebrity for the reclusive consulting detective. Watson, secretly, had anticipated a few days of peaceful exploration, perhaps a visit to the Guinness Brewery, far from the grim shadows of London's underworld. Their plans for leisurely enjoyment were swiftly curtailed. No sooner had they settled into their lodgings near St. Stephen's Green than a frantic knock heralded Inspector Michael O'Connell, a portly man with a perpetually furrowed brow and a distinctively Dublin brogue. His face was a mixture of bewilderment and exasperation. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, a most perplexing affair," O'Connell began without preamble, mopping his brow with a large handkerchief. "Another of these senseless attacks. Last night, Seamus O'Malley, the celebrated classical guitarist, found in an alleyway off Grafton Street. His hands, gentlemen, his fingers, broken. Every single one." Watson felt a jolt of horror. "Good heavens! And robbed, I presume?" O'Connell shook his head, a gesture of defeat. "That's the confounded thing, Doctor. Not a shilling touched, his expensive instrument case lying right beside him, undisturbed. Just his hands. Smashed. The lad won't play a note for a year, if ever again. Random violence, perhaps." Watson offered, though a knot of unease was already forming in his stomach. "That's what me men think, sir. Just some drunken louts, a senseless act of brutality. But then there's the other cases, the butcher last week, his kneecap shattered, nothing stolen either. And before that, a retired schoolmistress with a broken collarbone. No pattern, no motive, just fractured bones." The inspector threw up his hands. "It defies logic." Holmes, who had been listening with an unnerving stillness, finally stirred. His eyes, usually distant, now gleamed with an almost predatory interest. He picked up the local newspaper O'Connell had inadvertently brought, his gaze fixing on a small article detailing O'Malley's plight. "Fractured bones, you say, Inspector?" Holmes mused, his voice low and resonant. "And specifically targeting the means by which a man makes his livelihood? Or perhaps, the instruments of his passion?" He traced a finger along the headline. "This is no random hooliganism, Inspector O'Connell. This is a message. A brutal, intricate, and deeply personal message." Watson watched his friend, knowing that the peaceful Dublin sojourn had just dissolved into another labyrinth for the consulting detective to unravel. The hunt was on. Chapter 2. The unsettling declaration from Holmes cast a pall over their Dublin stay. Within the week, his pronouncement proved grimly prophetic, as the city found itself gripped by a series of increasingly bizarre and unsettling assaults. The pattern, or rather, the lack thereof, became the talk of every pub and drawing room. First, it was Mr. Finnegan, a renowned baker from Smithfield. He was found behind his shop one misty morning, his strong right arm, the one that had kneaded countless loaves, shattered in 3 places. Like O'Malley, nothing had been taken, and the attack seemed to vanish into the Dublin fog as swiftly as it had occurred. Witnesses, though few, reported seeing a gaunt, dark-haired man in a tattered coat fleeing the scene, muttering incoherently. Days later, the news carried tidings of another incident. Mrs. O'Leary, a notoriously stern but highly respected retired schoolmistress from the Liberties, suffered a broken femur. She had been taking her customary afternoon stroll when she was suddenly and violently brought down. Her attackers? A pair of boisterous youths, their faces obscured by caps pulled low, according to one elderly bystander who claimed to have caught a fleeting glimpse. Watson, poring over the sensational newspaper reports in their lodgings, felt a growing sense of frustration. "It makes no sense, Holmes," he exclaimed, gesturing wildly at the headlines. A classical guitarist, a baker, a retired schoolmistress. They share no common ground. One attack describes a vagrant, another points to street toughs. How can you insist this is a single hand at work? Holmes, however, remained unperturbed. He sat by the window, a pipe clutched between his teeth, his gaze fixed on the bustling street below, yet clearly seeing beyond the immediate scene. A stack of police reports, maps of Dublin, and scraps of paper filled with his minute handwriting lay scattered on the small table beside him. "Precisely, Watson. The very lack of connection is the most compelling connection of all," Holmes murmured, a wisp of smoke curling lazily from his lips. "Consider the contradictory descriptions of the assailants. A gaunt vagrant, boisterous youths, a burly labourer described in the initial O'Malley attack, and even, Inspector O'Connell mentioned, a demure woman in a veiled hat near the incident with the butcher last week." He tapped a finger against a newspaper clipping. "These are not distinct individuals, my dear fellow. This is the work of a single, highly adaptable mind. A chameleon, if you will, changing colors to blend into the social landscape of each attack. The discrepancies are too pronounced, too convenient. Each description, while specific, is also generic enough to apply to a multitude of individuals, allowing the true perpetrator to vanish into the city's anonymity." Watson squinted at the reports. "But why such elaborate deception? If the aim is simply to break bones, why not simply strike and flee?" "Because, Watson," Holmes replied, finally turning his piercing gaze upon his friend, "the act itself is not merely about the broken bone. It is about the message, as I said. And to deliver such a precise, personal message, the messenger must remain unseen, unknown. Our maniac, for he is undoubtedly that, seeks not merely to inflict pain, but to orchestrate a peculiar form of terror. He stalks his victims, assumes a role that allows him proximity, executes his brutal task, and then dissolves into the urban tapestry, leaving behind only fractured limbs and conflicting eyewitness accounts. It is a performance, Watson, a macabre play with Dublin as its stage, and its lead actor a master of disguise. The thought of a single individual, effortlessly transforming from a tattered vagrant to a veiled woman, stalking the unsuspecting citizens of Dublin, sent a shiver down Watson's spine. His initial hope for a peaceful sojourn had evaporated entirely, replaced by the familiar thrill and apprehension of a complex case. Holmes, meanwhile, already appeared to be mapping out his next move, a glint of growing insight in his eyes as he considered the elaborate charade unfolding around them. Chapter 3. The Inspector O'Connell, though initially bewildered by Holmes's theories, was not entirely devoid of practical sense. Faced with Holmes's unwavering conviction, and the increasing public anxiety over the seemingly random attacks, he grudgingly granted the detective access to the various crime scenes. This was precisely the opportunity Holmes required. While the Dublin constabulary focused on interviewing witnesses and searching for conventional clues, Holmes undertook a meticulous, almost ritualistic, examination of each location. Watson, accustomed to his friend's unique methods, trailed silently, notebook in hand, documenting every observation. At the alley where Seamus O'Malley's fingers had been shattered, Holmes did not simply note the lack of theft. He scraped tiny flecks of a peculiar, iridescent dust from the damp cobblestones, undetectable to the casual eye. Near Mr. Finnegan's bakery, where the baker's arm was broken, Holmes noted a faint, almost imperceptible scent of theatrical grease paint lingering in the humid air, easily masked by the rich aroma of baking bread. And in the park where Mrs. O'Leary had fallen, he found a discarded, inexpensive brooch, a common enough trinket, but one that seemed out of place given the supposed youthful assailants. The police, with their admirable but often myopic focus on direct evidence, see only what is immediately apparent, Holmes remarked to Watson as they navigated the labyrinthine streets, their cab occasionally splashing through puddles. They hear conflicting descriptions and conclude separate perpetrators. They observe a lack of theft and dismiss motive. He held up a small, folded cloth, containing the dust and a few stray fibers. But consider these. The dust, consistent with a type of powdered glitter often used in stage makeup. The scent, a clear indication of theatrical application. And the brooch, Watson, a trifle that might seem insignificant, but its very ordinariness is its significance. A prop, perhaps, carelessly discarded. Holmes's mind was a maelstrom of deduction. He systematically dismantled the prevailing theories. The idea of gang warfare was absurd, there was no turf disputed, no rival factions targeted. Political motivation? The victims were too diverse, too politically inert, to be chosen for any ideological statement. No, the common thread was not external, but internal to the perpetrator's design. The genius of our assailant, Holmes explained, tapping his pipe against the window of their cab, lies not merely in the effectiveness of his disguises, but in their very inconsistency. He doesn't seek to perfectly impersonate one type of person for each crime. He seeks to plant a seed of doubt, to create a cloud of conflicting imagery. The burly laborer, the demure woman, the tattered vagrant, the rowdy youth, each a plausible yet ultimately misleading silhouette designed to confound direct identification. Watson began to grasp the subtlety of the maniac's cunning. So, he uses these diverse appearances to make us believe there are multiple attackers, when in fact, it is only one master of deception. Precisely, my dear Watson. A single individual, capable of inhabiting multiple roles with convincing realism, yet leaving behind these almost imperceptible clues that, when pieced together, scream of a singular, theatrical hand. He is a playwright, director, and sole actor in his own grim drama. The purpose of the disguises, therefore, is not merely to get away clean, but to ensure that his true identity, his true motivation, remains utterly obscured by the sheer chaos of misinformation. Our task now is to look beyond the stage and discover the puppeteer. The glint in Holmes's eyes intensified. He was not merely intrigued, he was engaged in a battle of wits with a formidable, if disturbingly motivated, opponent. The game, as he often called it, had well and truly begun. Chapter 4. With the understanding that the attacker was a master of disguise and deception, Holmes shifted his focus from the how of the attacks to the why. He now believed the key lay not in the conflicting descriptions of the perpetrators, but in the chilling consistency of their actions, the specific nature of the injuries themselves. "Watson," Holmes announced one morning, abruptly pulling a fresh sheet of paper towards him. "Cease your attempts to reconcile the witness accounts, they are designed to mislead. Instead, I require you to become a chronicler of pain. Document, with your medical precision, not merely the injury, but its implication. Its precise location, its probable instrument, and most critically, its impact on the victim's very essence. Watson, though initially puzzled by this redirection, recognized the familiar spark in Holmes's eyes. He retrieved his medical texts and began to systematically list the known victims. First, Seamus O'Malley, the classical guitarist, multiple metacarpal and phalangeal fractures, both hands. Instrument likely blunt force, possibly a heavy object wielded with extreme intent. Impact, complete cessation of musical career, profound psychological distress, loss of identity. Next, Mr. Finnegan, the baker, spiral fracture of the right humerus, severe. Instrument, likely a swift, powerful blow. Impact, incapacitation from doneading, severe economic hardship, likely loss of business, disruption of daily ritual. Then, Mrs. O'Leary, the retired schoolmistress, comminuted fracture of the right femur. Instrument, high-impact force, possibly a fall induced by a direct blow. Impact, loss of mobility, forced confinement, severing of daily routines, including her cherished afternoon strolls. As Watson diligently compiled this macabre inventory, a disturbing pattern began to emerge, one that sent a shiver of understanding down his spine. He looked up, his face pale. Holmes, it's not random at all. The guitarist's hands, the baker's arm, the schoolmistress's leg, these aren't just broken bones. They are the deliberate sabotage of each victim's defining characteristic, their livelihood, their very way of life. Holmes nodded slowly, a grim satisfaction in his gaze. Precisely, Watson. This is not the work of a mindless brute. This is the calculated handiwork of someone who understands, intimately, what makes each victim who they are, and then meticulously chooses to disable that very thing. The violence is never fatal, you will note. Never a shot fired, a knife plunged. But always debilitating, always designed to inflict maximum personal and professional damage. He rose and walked to the window, peering out at the bustling Dublin street as if seeking answers in its crowds. Consider the meticulous planning involved. To know the guitarist's hands were his life. To know the baker's arm was his craft. To know the schoolmistress's leg was her independence. This requires not just observation, but an almost obsessive level of knowledge about each individual. A deep-seated grievance, perhaps, but one refined over time, nurtured, until it became this precise, chilling form of retribution. But who could hold such grudges against such disparate people? Watson mused aloud, the enormity of the implication dawning on him. And why would they wait so long, only to strike now? Those, my dear Watson, are the questions that now demand our full attention, Holmes replied, turning from the window, his eyes alight with intellectual hunger. The perpetrator is not simply breaking bones, he is speaking to us through them. And he is telling a very old story indeed. We must learn to read his language of injury. The chilling precision of the maniac's acts was no longer a mystery, but a terrifying clue leading deeper into the heart of a concealed vendetta. Chapter 5. The common thread, Watson, Holmes declared over a breakfast of strong Irish tea and somewhat less appealing porridge, is not in their present circumstances, but in their shared past. Our chameleon, our master of disguised retribution, has an encyclopedic knowledge of his victims. Such detailed targeting speaks not of chance encounters, but of long-nurtured grievances. I believe we are dealing with a man who carries a list. Watson blinked. A list, Holmes? Like a ledger of slights. Precisely, Holmes affirmed, pushing his untouched porridge aside. A meticulously compiled, deeply personal register of every individual who, in his twisted perception, has caused him harm. And he is now systematically working his way through it. The randomness of the attacks, the disparate victims, the varied disguises, all serve to obscure the underlying structure, to convince the authorities that there is no connection. But the connection, my dear fellow, lies in the heart of our maniac's bitterness. The detective then laid out his instructions. We must delve into the backgrounds of our victims. Not just their recent histories, but their formative years. Their childhoods, their early schooling, their first residencies. It will be an arduous task, I grant you, sifting through the dust of decades, but I am convinced the key lies there. Watson, armed with Holmes's unerring logic, embarked upon what felt like an impossible mission. He spent days poring over Dublin's historical records, dusty parish registries, old-school attendance logs, and dilapidated electoral rolls. He interviewed neighbors, spoke to long-retired civil servants, and even visited the dilapidated former addresses of the victims, piecing together fragments of their lives from a bygone era. It was a tedious, painstaking process, yielding little fruit initially. The victims' lives seemed to diverge sharply after their early years, leading to vastly different social strata and professions. However, after days of sifting through minutiae, a faint pattern began to emerge. A shared school, a brief period of residence in the same parish, an overlapping year in a particular neighborhood. It was tenuous, almost imperceptible, buried beneath layers of time and urban redevelopment. But Holmes's earlier insistence on a tight-knit, working-class neighborhood resonated. Holmes! Watson exclaimed late one evening, his voice hoarse from hours in the Dublin archives, his finger tracing a faded line on an old map. Seamus O'Malley, the guitarist. Mr. Finnegan, the baker, and even Mrs. O'Leary, the schoolmistress, they all, at different points in their childhoods, lived within a few blocks of each other, in an area then known as St. Patrick's Ward. It's now largely redeveloped, but it was a dense, poor district decades ago. Holmes rose from his armchair, his pipe forgotten. His eyes, usually half closed in contemplation, snapped open. Excellent, Watson. Excellent work. The very link we sought, obscured by the passage of time and the growth of the city. A crucible, perhaps, where grudges were forged and resentment simmered. He gestured towards the map. A small, insular community. Where slights would fester, where reputations could be made or ruined by a single incident. Now, Watson, we need to identify the one who, during that specific period, would have had cause to remember each of our victims, to nurse a grievance so potent it could survive decades. We seek an individual whose life would have intersected with all of theirs in a meaningful, perhaps painful, way. His finger paused on an old-school register, next to a name circled by Watson. And who, in that close-knit environment, might have been a target himself. Someone overlooked, perhaps, or perceived as weak. Someone named Patrick O'Malley. The name appears on several of these old records, often in the same year as our current victims. Could he be the thread connecting these disparate lives? The architect of this long-delayed, precise retribution. The implications were chilling. The random attacks were anything but. They were chapters in a very old story, written in the heart of a bitter man, waiting for his moment to strike. The hunt had narrowed, they now had a ghost from the past to pursue. Chapter 6. The faded maps and dusty records had yielded their secret. St. Patrick's Ward, a name now echoing with forgotten resentments, became the focal point of their investigation. It was a place where, decades ago, the lives of Seamus O'Malley, the gifted guitarist, Mr. Finnegan, the industrious baker, and Mrs. O'Leary, the stern schoolmistress, had briefly intersected. But more importantly, it was the crucible where a young, perhaps vulnerable, Patrick O'Malley had also resided. The list, Watson, Holmes articulated, as they prepared to venture into the transformed district, is not merely a theoretical construct now. It is a tangible reality in the mind of our culprit. He is a man who remembers. And such memories, particularly those steeped in perceived injustice, can be a potent poison, stewing for decades. The St. Patrick's ward of yesteryear was barely recognizable. Modern buildings stood where tenements once huddled, and bustling streets had replaced narrow lanes. Yet, Holmes and Watson sought out the vestiges of the past. They frequented the oldest pubs, where stories were as aged as the whiskey, and knocked on the doors of residents who had resisted the tide of change, their memories the last remaining links to the district's former character. They discovered that the name Patrick O'Malley was not entirely uncommon, but their inquiries began to coalesce around a specific Patrick from that era. An elderly woman, her face a roadmap of Dublin's history, recalled a Paddy O'Malley from her childhood. A quiet lad, she'd said, always with his nose in a book, kept to himself mostly. A bit of a dreamer, some said. Others weren't so kind. Another, a retired dockworker with a surprisingly sharp memory, added a crucial detail. Paddy O'Malley. The lad who lived down by the old fish market. Always seemed to have a target on his back, he did. The older boys, they'd torment him. And young Seamus O'Malley, the musician's father, a right bully he was, always tripping Paddy up. And Finnegan's father, the baker, he was known for being a harsh taskmaster with his lads, never a kind word for anyone who wasn't up to scratch. And that Mrs. O'Leary, when she was just a young teacher, Lord bless her, she had a tongue that could skin a cat, especially with the shy ones. The fragments began to align, painting a disturbing portrait. Patrick O'Malley was not just a name, he was a persona, a symbol of the overlooked and the undervalued in a tough, working-class community. The descriptions emerging were of a child who absorbed every slight, every unkind word, every petty cruelty, not with outward defiance, but with a quiet, inward resentment. It is a classic profile, Watson, Holmes observed, as they reviewed their notes in a quiet corner of a fading Dublin library. The sensitive, perhaps introverted child, subjected to the casual brutalities of daily life. The small slights, the public humiliations, the perceived injustices that an adult might shrug off, but which, to a young, impressionable mind, etch themselves deep into the psyche. Holmes tapped a finger on a list of names they had compiled. Seamus O'Malley, the current victim, was named after his father, a notorious bully. Mr. Finnegan, the baker, inherited his father's business, a business that might have once employed young Patrick, and perhaps treated him poorly. Mrs. O'Leary, the teacher, known for her sharp tongue, would have overseen his early education. And we have accounts of neighborhood children who mocked him, tradesmen who slighted him, even a few adults who dismissed him with contempt. So, this list is more than just names, Watson mused, a chilling realization settling in. It's a ledger of childhood hurts, meticulously recorded and carried into adulthood, festering until it became this violent obsession. Precisely, Holmes confirmed, his eyes alight with grim understanding. Our task now is to find the man who became the vessel for that decades-old bitterness. To track down the adult Patrick O'Malley and confront the ghost of a child's revenge. The pieces were falling into place, revealing a motivation as bizarre as it was deeply human, rooted in the fertile soil of forgotten slights and unaddressed pain. Chapter 7. Armed with a name and a compelling theory, Holmes and Watson set about tracing the adult Patrick O'Malley. The task proved surprisingly straightforward. While the child Patrick had been largely overlooked, the man had retreated into a life of quiet reclusion. He worked as a meticulous, if solitary, archivist for a small historical society, a profession that perfectly suited his detailed memory and detached demeanor. His current address, a modest terraced house on the outskirts of the city, was obtained with relative ease. The air was thick with unspoken tension as Holmes and Watson approached O'Malley's front door. It was a nondescript dwelling, curtains drawn, a small, overgrown garden hinting at a lack of engagement with the outside world. Holmes rapped sharply, the sound echoing unnervingly in the quiet street. After a moment, the door creaked open, revealing a man in his late 50s. He was thin, with stooped shoulders and a shock of prematurely grey hair. His eyes, though intelligent, held a weary, almost haunted look. This was not the imposing figure of a violent criminal, but rather a man worn down by an invisible burden. "Mr. Patrick O'Malley, I presume." Holmes's voice was calm, devoid of accusation, yet it carried an undeniable weight. "My name is Sherlock Holmes, and this is Dr. Watson. We've come about the recent incidents in Dublin." O'Malley's eyes, initially clouded with mild annoyance at the interruption, now sharpened with a flicker of recognition, then a deep-seated fear. He didn't try to feign ignorance. He simply stared, as if a long-expected reckoning had finally arrived. He stepped back, silently inviting them in. The small sitting room was meticulously ordered, filled with books and old maps, but an oppressive stillness hung in the air. "The classical guitarist, Seamus O'Malley," Holmes began, his gaze fixed on the man. "The baker, Mr. Finnegan. The retired schoolmistress, Mrs. O'Leary. All connected, Mr. O'Malley, not by chance, but by a shared past in St. Patrick's Ward. And by you." Patrick O'Malley remained silent, his hands clasped tightly before him. His face, though pale, betrayed no surprise, only a profound weariness. "You knew their fathers," Holmes continued, relentlessly. "You knew their younger selves. You remembered every slight, every unkind word, every injustice, no matter how small, inflicted upon you during your childhood. And you sought your revenge, not in death, but in a crippling, personal retaliation designed to mirror the original hurt." Slowly, deliberately, Patrick O'Malley reached into his waistcoat pocket and withdrew a small, folded, yellowed piece of paper. It was creased and worn from years of handling, clearly a relic of a distant past. With trembling fingers, he unfolded it. It was a child's handwriting, untidy and earnest, listing names. Each name was followed by a brief, often childish, description of the perceived wrong. The note, O'Malley whispered, his voice raspy, as if unused to prolonged speech. "My children's times. Every one of them. The bullies who broke my toys. The teacher who shamed me for being slow. The baker who sold me stale bread and laughed. The neighbor who spread lies about my mother." He looked up, his eyes now blazing with a quiet, almost righteous, fury. "They all hurt me, Mr. Holmes. They left me broken, for years. I simply returned the favor. In kind." Watson felt a chill deeper than any Dublin fog. Here, in this quiet room, was the bizarre and terrifying logic of the maniac. The broken fingers of the guitarist for the bully father's cruel hands. The shattered arm of the baker for the father's harshness. The broken leg of the schoolmistress for her sharp words that had crippled a timid child's spirit. "You did not kill," Holmes observed, his voice still level. "You broke bones. You crippled their livelihoods, their passions, their independence. But you never took a life." "No," O'Malley confirmed, a faint, disturbing smile playing on his lips. "That would be too easy. Death is swift. This is a reminder. A taste of what they made me feel. The pattern, Mr. Holmes, was always there. You just had to know where to look." The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place for Watson. The random nature of the attacks, the diverse victims, the constantly shifting disguises, all were an elaborate smokescreen designed to hide the deeply personal, meticulously planned vengeance of a man haunted by the slights of his childhood. Patrick O'Malley, the unassuming archivist, stood before them, the living embodiment of a decades-long vendetta, a chilling testament to the corrosive power of unaddressed bitterness. Chapter 8. The arrival of Inspector O'Connell and his men was discreet, summoned by a coded message from Holmes earlier that day. Patrick O'Malley offered no resistance. He simply sat, the worn, yellowed note still clutched in his hand, his eyes distant, as if already reliving the slights that had fueled his life's dark purpose. The police, initially bewildered, became stunned as Holmes laid out the extraordinary nature of the case, presenting the list and explaining the meticulously planned retribution. "A grudge held for 40 years, O'Connell muttered, shaking his head in disbelief, as his constables led a placid O'Malley away. Against people who likely didn't even remember him, let alone the minor infractions he claimed. It's beyond belief." Back at their lodgings, a sense of profound disquiet settled over Holmes and Watson. The Dublin fog had lifted, revealing a clear, cold sky, but the chill within them remained. "You see now, Watson," Holmes said, pouring them both a glass of Irish whiskey, a rare indulgence. The true horror of this case was not merely the physical violence, but its underlying motive. The common pattern of the victims, which so long eluded the authorities and even ourselves, was not geographic or social, but psychological. Each target represented a personification of a childhood trauma for O'Malley. Their present identities, professions, and vulnerabilities were merely the canvas upon which he painted his decades-old vengeance. Watson stared into his glass, the amber liquid reflecting the flickering firelight. The guitarist's hands, the baker's arm, the schoolmistress's leg. Each injury directly attacked the very core of their being, their means of expression or independence. He wasn't just breaking bones, Holmes, he was symbolically dismantling the essence of who they were, just as he felt his own essence had been chipped away, piece by piece, as a child. "Precisely," Holmes affirmed, his gaze thoughtful. And his elaborate disguises, his chameleonic ability to appear as a different assailant each time, served not only to evade capture but also to further obscure his deeper purpose. He wanted the acts to seem random, to suggest a chaotic, meaningless world, because in his own childhood, he perceived a similar, meaningless cruelty directed at him. "It's a chilling testament to the corrosive power of unaddressed bitterness," Watson reflected, a sigh escaping him. "To carry such a burden for so long, nurturing it, until it erupts in such a calculated and destructive manner. The very act of creating that list, a child's desperate attempt to document his pain, became the blueprint for his adult madness." Holmes nodded, his expression uncharacteristically somber. "Indeed." O'Malley believed he was simply rebalancing the scales, delivering justice as he saw it. In his mind, he wasn't committing a crime, but fulfilling a long-overdue sentence. It highlights the profound and sometimes terrifying consequences of forgotten slights and the human capacity for nurturing resentment over a lifetime, a darker side of memory rarely encountered even in our vast experience. The case of the Dublin vendetta closed, leaving behind not just broken bones, but a lingering question of human nature. How many other quiet, unassuming individuals harbored such hidden ledgers of grievance? And what would it take for their own peculiar brand of justice to finally surface? For Holmes and Watson, the Emerald City had revealed a darkness as profound as any they had encountered in the fog-laden alleys of London, a stark reminder that the human heart, when wounded and left untended, could become the most dangerous of all landscapes.